On this episode of AFPC Insights, I'm joined by our Senior Fellow in Middle East Studies, Mora Namaddar, who's going to discuss U.S.-Iranian relations under the Biden administration. Hey, Mora.
Thank you so much, Annie. I'm so honored to be here with you and with AFPC. I'm really grateful to be a senior fellow. I was so lucky to serve in the last administration as a senior advisor for the Iran Action Group, as vice president at USAGM, and also as the acting assistant secretary of state for consular affairs near the end of the term. One thing I have to say I'm very grateful about is the Trump administration not only gave me these opportunities, but allowed for new perspectives. I was lucky enough to work with a handful of really extraordinary colleagues who understood that Iran policy is not black and white, is not war capitulation. There are other alternatives. There is a different path, and understanding what the best path to take is related to a core fundamental point, that US national security interests and Iranian human rights interests are directly aligned. Anything that comes from any kind of engagement with Iran has to understand that fundamental point. One thing that has been really interesting to see is the support of voices inside Iran from the Trump administration, voices that came out like the Council of 14, who brought about a new and interesting demand from not only the Iranian regime, but from the world in total. They're speaking directly on behalf of the Iranian people as Iranians inside Iran, and making sure that their voices are heard was a priority of the Trump administration, and something that I was extraordinarily proud to be a part of.
So I have a few questions for you, given your expertise on this issue, and obviously it's a salient one. First, Iran's opposition is notoriously fragmented and has been for years, but lately we've been seeing the emergence of a new consensus from opposition forces in the form of the No to the Islamic Republic campaign. Can you explain a little bit about what it stands for and why it's significant?
Absolutely. So your point is very well taken. There has been a fragmented opposition for many years. This new, quote unquote, No to the Islamic Republic campaign is actually something that has spawned, and it's very interesting, from internal to Iran. So it's a very exciting movement where any opposition group that has come out, they've always had different factions and different ideology. But this is a coming together of all these organizations saying, no matter what we disagree on, we can all agree that we are saying no to the Islamic Republic. So I wrote about this over a decade ago in the National Security Law Brief when I was in law school, and basically said that, listen, the No to Pinochet campaign, which is what brought an end to Augusto Pinochet's rule in Chile, is a great example for the Iranian people to take note of and to learn from, right? So that is, I think, a great inspiration for what the No campaign is today inside of Iran. What has happened is these groups are asking for a referendum on the legitimacy of not only the government, which they asked for during the Green Movement of 2009, but they're saying we want a referendum on the entire system, and we reject the idea of Islamic theocracy. This is a organization and a group of people coming together saying that, no, we need to vote on our future. We want secular democracy. We want to be able to decide for ourselves. So that's where the No campaign is coming from. That's taking from the lessons of history and also implementing it in a way that makes sense for the diverse population that is the Iranian people.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. What do you think the proper place, what is the proper place of the Iranian opposition? I know we've heard a lot about the assorted anti-regime groups that can exist both inside and outside of the country, but can it really make a difference in the struggle over Iran's political future?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of different opposition groups, right? I mean, there's the MEK, there's communists, there's monarchists, there's all sorts of different factions between. So there's a lot of opposition groups external to Iran that have maybe a presence inside Iran as well, right? But I think what is a huge thing to focus on here is that the future leader of Iran is not in Paris or Potomac. They're not in London, New York, or DC, right? The future leader of Iran, the Nelson Mandela of Iran, the Lech Walesa of Iran, the Martin Luther King Jr. of Iran, whoever he or she may be, is inside Iran right now. They're fighting the struggle. They're the ones that are battling the regime day to day with skin in the game against the regime and bleeding for it, right? They're not living comfortable lives in Western countries, waxing poetic about how, things should change and what they would do. These are the people that are actually fighting for it, right? So what we have here is a situation in which the opposition can be useful if they choose to be useful, right? The opposition can be useful if they serve to amplify the voices of the people inside Iran. So any opposition group that's external, as long as they're amplifying the true voices inside the country, they can be helpful, right? Because end of the day, I think they all agree on the idea of no to the Islamic Republic. And that's where the focus should be.
So Mora, the Biden administration has suggested that the maximum pressure campaign has failed and that there's no alternative to talking to Tehran. Is that true?
So that's absolutely false. Right.
Okay.
It's extraordinarily dishonest and intellectually dishonest to pretend that the maximum pressure campaign was anything but a wild success. So this is a fallacy that's often put in place by people and activists, many of them pro-regime activists, who want people to believe there's only two options with Iran, right? It's either war or capitulation. And that's a fallacy. That's not true. Right? So you don't have to give pallets of the cash to the Iranian regime and couch it as diplomacy in order to say that you're anti-war. This is the fallacy that has been perpetuated and frankly is a lie. So there is a third option, and it is utilizing maximum pressure, the very successful maximum pressure campaign, but in tandem, recognizing that support of the Iranian people is core to the strategy, right? So President Trump did this extraordinarily well, right? And I can give you an example. I can prove this point. President Trump had the most comprehensive sanctions program on the regime, right? Simultaneously making sure these sanctions never targeted the people. So despite, Zarif and Khamenei's points that, oh, these sanctions hurt people because of medical supplies and food, it's a lie, right? It's a complete lie. We did a video with Brian Hook, special representative at the time, and we put an end to these myths, right? It is a fact, it's not a question, that US sanctions never target medical supplies. US sanctions never target humanitarian aid. US sanctions never target communication devices. US sanctions never target food and agricultural products. That's a fact. The sanctions were targeting the regime and its ability to reign terror, not only in the region, but at home, right? So the Iranian regime is not only an adversary for America, for our regional allies, but also for the Iranian people themselves. The people are very sophisticated. The Iranian people are extraordinarily smart, right? And so they recognize this. That's why President Trump had extraordinarily high approval ratings from the Iranian people while still engaging in an aggressive sanctions campaign against the regime, right? There's a difference between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime, and President Trump understood this fully. That's why he had the most liked tweet in Farsi in history, right? Side note, it's pretty interesting that the president was censored, right? And that tweet no longer is on the internet. Of course, people have screenshots and can show it's the most liked Farsi tweet in history. But meanwhile, while the American president is censored, you have Khamenei and Zarif allowed on Twitter with no note whatsoever about these people who have been brutal subjugators of their own people. So it's an interesting side note on where we are in America today and sort of the issues we're dealing with. But the proof is in the pudding, right? Maximum pressure gave us a huge amount of leverage. The regime's foreign currency reserves went from 400 billion to around 4 billion. That is a success. The less resource a regime has, the less money they can spend on terror, whether it's at home or abroad, right? So pretending that the maximum pressure campaign was anything but a success is frankly intellectually dishonest.
I just have one more question for you. This week, the Republican Study Committee released a major new piece of legislation known as the Maximum Pressure Act that is designed to codify the 12 points Secretary Pompeo laid out back in 2018. What did those points lay out exactly? And do you think this new legislation will make a difference?
Absolutely. I think this is a great idea. This legislation, I think, is very important. The 12 points are extraordinarily important. So I think that the mistake of the Obama administration was that they wanted to put the JCPOA in at any and all cost. And they knew that they didn't have the majority in the Senate to make it a formal treaty. But these agreements between nations must be formal treaties. You have to have the support of legislators at home in order to make anything like this not only stick, but have any sort of legitimacy, right? So if the Biden administration wants to be bipartisan, as it has claimed, but we haven't seen, they have to have this rise to a level of a treaty. I think this legislation shows how seriously Republicans are taking this issue, and that none of these 12 points can be cast aside. I mean, we're talking about points that are extraordinarily basic. You're talking about making sure that the regime doesn't finance and fund and give material support to terrorist groups in the region, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or anybody else, right? You're talking about freeing American hostages and hostages of allies that are held on spurious charges, right? So you're not talking about the points that are astronomically difficult. You're talking about very basic points. And actually, to that end, this is something that, I was lucky enough to work on with the secretary when we said that, human rights is the biggest and 13th point, but really it should be the first point upon which everything else flows from. The secretary did a speech on December 19th of 2019, which was very well received. And that really encompassed our strategy of not only the 12 points of maximum pressure, but also the central focus of human rights. Human rights is where everything else flows from. A regime that respects human rights domestically and abroad doesn't do the things that this regime does, right? So that's where this all can and should flow out from, is the core fundamental 13th, but should be the first point of human rights. And I think that can be very, very effective. I think that would be the right policy for not only US national security interests, but Iranian human rights interests.
Sure. So I guess it's another wait and see how this legislation plays out. But until then, thank you so much for chatting with me. And welcome to AFPC. So we're so happy to have you.